was the grain elevator worker who turned out to be a Cambridge fellow and mathematician, an intellectual, a scholar. Another guest, a lonely, disheartened, unemployed bachelor, turned out to be the scion, that is, a lineal descendant of one of England's oldest families. Unfortunately, this blue-blooded fellow had trouble holding a job. So inspired by his place and time in his adopted country, he kept putting down his tools, picking up a pencil to immortalize his observations in verse. Kathleen had some misgivings about another guest, a taciturn individual regarded by many as a severe and unapproachable fellow. In retrospect, it is easy to understand the man's demeanor. Life was tough on the prairies. You had to be tough to survive. Yet this grouch was transformed, she writes, by 2 glasses of port into a most delightful dinner table companion and an intimate of the very best literature. Sometimes, final illustration that they give, the hospitality unexpectedly revealed just how destitute the visitors really were. Imagine the shame and wretchedness of the young man who fell violently ill immediately after dinner. A doctor was summoned, and the boy was bedridden for days. His malady was easily diagnosed. He had not had a real meal for weeks. Finally, given the opportunity to eat his fill, his digestive system simply rebelled. Whole bunch of hospitality experiences that this couple went through. Very, very interesting. Let me segue from there to 6 key statements that I want to share with you this morning. 6 key statements. The first one, a healthy and growing church is inevitably a gracious, welcoming church. People vote with their feet, so to speak. They go where they feel they belong. Some years ago, a guy called Christian Schwartz did a worldwide study of healthy, growing churches. And with other researchers, they were after the key ingredients that make for a healthy, growing church. And after they had interviewed leaders and parishioners from 1,000 different churches across all countries of the world, different language groups and cultures, they came up with a list of 8 key ingredients. I'm not going to list them all to you, just the final one. The final one is loving relationships. For instance, he says, we asked how much time members spend with one another outside of official church-sponsored events. How often do they invite one another over for meals or a cup of coffee? How generous is the church in doling out compliments? To what extent is the pastor aware of the personal problems of lay workers in the church? How much laughter is there in the church? And the answers to those questions in healthy, growing churches was always in the positive. Those were key elements that were being answered positively. Second statement. Many unchurched people today first need to sense that they belong before they are willing to believe. Acts or habits of hospitality, I think, can be very key in moving them along this continuum of being maybe at arm's length and disinterested in God, Jesus, the church, to more interested, somewhat interested, to eventually belonging, and someday hopefully also believing. Another illustration on that one comes from our own church. Are Merle and Yvonne here this morning? Hebert? I've shared this one once previously, but I'll repeat it, because that one person at least will not have heard it, that mentioned that in the evaluation, that they hadn't heard me speak on this topic. Yvonne Hebert, when she was younger, spent a summer out at Banff working. And in the restaurant where she was working, one day she met a gal from Hamburg. They got talking, and this gal said, I'm still here for a couple of weeks in Canada, but I'm out of money, so I really don't know what I'm going to do. Yvonne said, oh, you can stay with me for free, so come on over. And so she spent a couple of weeks with her. They had conversations late into the night. Amongst other things, they talked about the suffering in the world, and she was dealing with some issues in her own family, this gal from Hamburg. And in the course of those couple of days or weeks that they were together, this gal from Hamburg ended up receiving Jesus Christ. And it all started, says Yvonne, with that initial hospitable act, inviting this person to stay with her. Thirdly, by and large, I think that Canadians have become somewhat complacent, especially when it comes to intercultural interactions with others. As I've been here now, back in Canada for the last 8 years, I listen carefully, and I think typically Canadians think nowadays, you know, those new people that come to Canada, the strangers in our midst, once they have learned the language and we can communicate decently in English, then maybe we will consider inviting them or engaging with them. Hospitality is our chance as Christians to show them that Christians are different. Think of the REST team that went into action to help our refugee family integrate into Canada, family that came 2 years ago to Canada from Ethiopia or northern Kenya, where they were in a refugee camp. Or think of the SEALs ministry that has been functioning now out of our church campus here for the last half year or so, English and literacy services. Biblically speaking, there's always a reciprocity, a mutuality in the hospitality experience. Guests and their hosts each bring some blessing to the other, sometimes in material ways, but often enough in other ways. That's where the surprise element of hospitality comes in. Fourth statement, we serve a most hospitable God who makes strangers into friends. God himself has proven himself over and over again to be the epitome of the hospitable person. No wonder the Greek words used, you can see it up here, for hospitality, the Greek word on the top there, philoxenia, made up of two words, philos, which can mean either love or friend, and xenos, which is stranger. So love of the stranger or making friends out of strangers. Over against that other word that you've sometimes heard, xenophobia, which is a fear of strangers or even an antagonism towards strangers. Fifthly, engaging in hospitality carries with it some at times very unique promises and blessings. Turn in your Bibles to page 1214, 1214. There you'll find this text that I've shared at previous times as well. And I won't go into much detail, but it's worth reading again, because the text that you heard read by Maurice from Genesis 18 is probably the text that is alluded to in this text in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Now I'll start with verse 1. That's page 1214 in the Pew Bibles, Hebrews 13. Here's the text, and I think it's a truly amazing one, so pay close attention. The writer of this book, of this letter, begins with the words, verse 1, "Let brotherly love continue. Let it be a part of your daily lives." Question, how does it express itself practically? Verses 2 and following give the answer. We'll only look at verse 2. "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." So most commentators believe that this text in Hebrews 13 alludes to that story in Genesis 18. The rather unexpected blessing of this hospitality experience for Abraham and Sarah was this. One of those guests, who in hindsight turns out to be an angel guest, has come to deliver a prophetic message to these two old people. They are 90, 100 years old, respectively. A message that comes true less than a year later. Finally, the birth of a child, a son, Isaac. No wonder Sarah laughed when she heard the news. But the whole story hinges on that initial act of hospitality, much like in the case of Yvonne, that person coming to Christ, that gal from Hamburg, was occasioned by her act of hospitality. So what I'm trying to say, here's the major point for this talk this morning. Hospitality possesses a unique, I would say even almost deceptive power, not only to break through the loneliness and the longing of that other person, but also to break the stranglehold of evil within our own hearts. I mean the stranglehold of withholding God's grace, his gifts from others. Now, I need to take you a little bit on memory lane, Walter's memory lane experience this morning. I was a young boy growing up in Vancouver. My room down in the basement with my two brothers, they had windows in the rooms. I had no windows in my room. It was a small, dark room. So many evenings I would go to bed and I'd listen to the Vancouver Canucks. And then by, let's say, 10:45, that would be over. And then I'd wait for the Owl Prowl that started at 11 o'clock on CKNW. The radio station in Vancouver. And there I would listen to Radio Mystery Theater. One of the shows that I really liked, it was actually started way back in 1930, was called The Shadow. Listen to the opening lines of The Shadow. So every episode always began with this 30-second introduction. Enjoy it. Go ahead. That's good. That's what I listen to often, falling asleep at night. Now you know why I'm the person who I am today. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? God knows. And the evils that I'm talking about in the context of hospitality include things like these. We are so easily moved to become greedy and selfish, protective and private, ethnocentric and xenophobic, consumerist with an entertainment mindset, having and holding, competitive, keeping up with the Joneses. All of those things, in some shape or form, can fly in the face of true sharing and caring. Hospitality, which is what the hallmarks of the people of God throughout all times and places should be. Sixth statement, not engaging in hospitality opens one up to the disfavor of God. I won't read the text that you see, Matthew 25, but I invite you to reflect on it in the context of this message this morning, in your personal time. It's a warning text. When did you show me favor? God will ask in the judgment. The time when you invited somebody over, when you helped another person. That's kind of the gist of this text here. And then others who are rejected say, God, when did we see you and reject you? And he says, well, you did that when you rejected that poor person that came, or the person that needed your help in various contexts. Now, please note with a text like that it shouldn't be the fear of God's disfavor that drives you to be hospitable. Instead, it should be your understanding of God as the hospitable person to the nth degree that motivates you to want to become like him and to desire to represent him well here on earth. And yet, the text has this element to it. Refusing to extend hospitality at times does carry with it some grave consequences. Now, let me give you a couple of illustrations of hospitable behaviors right from within our own church here. True hospitality goes beyond things like cultural norms, financial constraints, personal biases. The Christmas project that we already introduced to you earlier and prayed for Ruth Avert, $14,000. I've been here 8 years now at this church, and for those of you who are new or maybe here for the very first time, this church is a very, very generous church. And I hope that it continues to be that way. This is a sign that it is alive and well. And may the next generation continue to be that way. Illustration number 2, hospitality and visitation. Would you take your bulletins for a sec and turn to the last page? We have a team here at this church led by Mick Thiessen. Mick, maybe you can just stand up so people who don't know you can actually see who you are. That's Mick Thiessen. She heads up, she coordinates a visitation ministry that focuses on visiting people, and that's about 60 of them from our congregation that are aged 80 and older. 60 people aged 80 and over. Did you know that? That's the first question there in this announcement, in the bulletin. I'm just going to read it. We have a visitation team. Each member of the team visits certain seniors on a regular basis. We go out for coffee, visit in their home, or connect through a phone call. Often we pray together. Some are shut in, others are still able to attend church. You would be surprised at how easy it is to visit with these folks who have been around for over 8 or 9 decades. They are full of stories and need a listening ear. The question is, will you be willing to visit these seniors? They would welcome your smiling face. Your age is not an issue, neither is the fact that you are married or single. God just calls us to be faithful. We are in need of couples as well as individuals. If you are willing to serve, please contact Mick, and her telephone is right there. This is a really important, another ministry of our church, and needing more people to engage in. Third illustration. A 30-day outreach event just concluded this past week that our missionaries, Jeremy and Adrian Penner, have been privileged to be a part of. I already referenced this on December 31st, last Sunday, but many of you weren't here, so I'll just say it again. They witnessed, under the leadership of a bunch of national Burmese pastors and evangelists, they experienced literally hundreds and hundreds of people coming to faith in Jesus Christ over the last 30 days, which were really very intense. They went into Thailand, they were in Burma or Myanmar, working with some Burmese people. And Pastor Isaiah, who is the lead evangelist pastor, he will be coming to this church on, help me, Barb or Kathy, it's even in the bulletin, I think, Thursday next week, right? Anyways, check the bulletin out. He'll be coming and speaking here, probably in the Heritage Hall or downstairs in the basement of the youth hall. But the connection to the sermon is this one. I've been getting the text messages through a WhatsApp group that they formed, or a messenger group that they formed during these last 30 days, and I've been praying with others for the success of this. This was their basic principle. Throw a party for any and all who are interested, lavish them with love and attention, and then share Jesus with them as the ultimate joy and grace giver. And in that case, hundreds and hundreds of people have responded to the gospel. This is really unique, and you might want to come and hear Isaiah. I'm going to be missing him because I'm gone down to South America myself. But these are some examples. So here's the bottom line question. What could possibly keep us or prevent us from such selfless, joyful, committed hospitality invested in others? People whom you previously maybe did not know at all, or just very little. 4 possible answers. One would be complacency. Complacency that is often fed by self-centeredness, a careless attitude. After all, we all know that hospitality costs, and not only financially. That's why Peter puts it this way in his letter: show hospitality to one another without grumbling, because he knows that hospitality means work and sometimes inconvenience. Number 2, culture. Sometimes we're just captivated by our culture. Canadians might just say, we don't invite others into our homes. Our homes are private spaces, aren't they? Where we retreat from rather than engage with other people. Conflict. Sometimes past negative experiences of hospitality keep you from engaging. People sometimes overstay their welcome. That has happened. Or they don't show appreciation for it. Or they are rather presumptuous, as happened just in the Advent season. There was a man that came off the street on a Thursday evening while the music team was practicing right here up on stage, and he asked for a place to stay. And so finally I got called. I came over and I engaged with him in conversation a little bit. I came intent on offering him a place to stay. We tried Today House, but that wasn't possible, which is a place for homeless people. But I came and I had a bit of a discussion with him, and the team had already had a bit of a conversation, but they needed to practice. So I took him outside here and got engaged in a conversation. And then this man shares with me, a very healthy man. And he didn't look like a person that just come, off the street or something. Wasn't smelly or anything, was, fairly well dressed. But he then shared that, within the last decade, his marriage went apart. And I think, if I remember right, around that time, he just began to go it on his own, off the grid. Been traveling across Canada for 7 years now, back and forth and back and forth. And he spoke a lot of Christianese, if I could call it that. He had a lot of Christian vocabulary. He said, I'm on the road for the Lord. But the more I listened to the story, the more skeptical I became. And I do believe that he has come to the point over these years that he's just a little bit presumptuous too, and just expects Christians to take him in while he's not working anymore, just traveling from place to place year by year. So sometimes presumptuous people, you deal with them. Just for your information, we did end up paying as a church for him to stay in the Days Inn for the night. Didn't want to put him out on a cold night on the street. But I had my questions, and so did the team. Finally, convenience. Sometimes the stressors of life get the better of us. Conflicting work schedules, kids' weekly programming, long 12-hour shifts in the healthcare field, and so on. And there's some very real stressors that do keep us from doing all that we might want to do. But the question is whether some of those stressors, at least, at times or in part, are maybe self-caused. Just a question for us to consider. So it's time to take action. The key point of all this is we all have experienced, or maybe are even currently experiencing, loneliness and longing for connection with others. The longing for familiar people, for particular places, at special times, such as birthdays, holidays, as in the Canada Book illustration. So how can we leverage our own personal experience of loneliness and longing that we can remember into action steps focused on others who might currently be experiencing what we have in the past? So I have 2 questions for you. And you might want to take one of those cards, welcome cards, flip them over, and maybe write your short answer to these 2 questions down. Or write it down in the bulletin, or just make a mental note of it, and then have a discussion at home. First one. Try to, first of all, recall one of your most lonely and longing times. The more recent, the better. One of your most lonely and longing times that you've ever experienced. Maybe it was when you left home for the first time to go to Bible school and you were gone over Christmas, been there, done that. Or maybe it was shortly after you immigrated to this country or another country. That can be a really lonely experience. My wife has been there, done that, and some of you have too. Try to find 2 or 3 words that describe that experience. Try to mull that over briefly. Maybe you were depressed and couldn't get out of bed. Or maybe you bawled your eyes out. Or maybe you drank way more than you should have. So that's the opening one. Recall a time when you were most lonely and longing. Second one, try to now recall anyone who made your loneliness or your longing at least a little bit more bearable. Try to recall that person or the group of people that made your loneliness, your longing more bearable. Maybe by inviting you to participate in their family Christmas or something like that. Give thanks for that person. And then you might, in the reflection upon that, ask yourself, could I be that kind of a person for somebody else in this congregation today or in the coming weeks or months, or in the community here with somebody else? That's how we can take action. In other words, if you truly desire that a church, this church, to be caring and sharing, then each one of us can take at least one step to become that person ourselves today. For example, you could make it a habit of intentionally sitting beside someone else here on Sunday mornings than the usual. You don't have to do it every Sunday, just make it a habit of doing it maybe once in a while, other than the usual friends or acquaintances. And when you sit beside somebody else, engage them in conversation after the service. Maybe invite them for a coffee or a lunch if you're courageous. And make sure that if you're in a small group, that your small group knows that you are called, each one of you, to care for each other. WhatsApp can be a great help for that you keep in touch with each other. That's how we're keeping in touch in our small group right now, through prayer, mutual encouragement, when life is going tough, and so on. And then, of course, again, the visitation team would be another example. So let me conclude. Back to this book. One more piece was added with reference to this couple that immigrated to Stettler, Alberta. In an article for the Lethbridge Herald, Kathleen Strange, that was a woman that had immigrated with her husband, confessed that, as appreciative as her guests might have been for the opportunity for good cheer and companionship, it was she and her husband who probably had most of the pleasure. She and her husband probably had most of the pleasure. And for those of you who have engaged in hospitality, most of you will vouch for the truth of that statement. Yes, there's cost and inconvenience and other things that sometimes go with the hospitality, the visitation, or the inviting into your life, but probably we get the most of the pleasure in the process. That's how God designed it. Surprise, surprise. And so, putting aside the occasional negative experience of hospitality that you've maybe had, humbly leave that with God, and putting aside the inconvenience or the cost involved, not just financially, let's remind ourselves that engaging in hospitable acts or behaviors of various kinds, from visitation to invitation, contains the seed, maybe multiple seeds, even promise of unexpected, often surprising blessings, and blessings that often come disguised in some rather strange people or strange experiences. God bless you as you think about these things and practice them. I'd like to invite the music team up front for